Some deaths refuse to stay buried. Some voices grow louder in silence. And some victims become hunters. When 23-year-old Maria Santos disappeared on a rain-soaked Tuesday night in October 2019, the small town of Millbrook thought they knew exactly what happened. Another young woman had fallen prey to the dangers that lurk in shadows. Another family would grieve. Another case would eventually grow cold. The police filed their reports. The newspapers ran their stories. The community held their vigils. Everyone assumed Maria had simply become another statistic in a world that too often fails to protect the innocent. They were wrong. What they didn't know was that Maria's story was just beginning. What they couldn't have imagined was that her death would unleash something far more terrifying than any living criminal. What they never suspected was that the very people who thought they had silenced her forever would soon discover that some voices cannot be buried. Over the next 18 months, 5 people would face encounters that defied explanation. 5 individuals who shared a dark secret would find themselves confronted by impossible visions, unexplained phenomena, and a presence that seemed to know their every guilty thought. This is not a ghost story. This is a story of justice served by hands that no longer belong to this world. This is the true account of how Maria Santos refused to become just another casualty, and how she made sure that those responsible would never forget her name. Prepare yourself for a journey into the impossible, where the line between life and death becomes meaningless, and where the truth refuses to stay hidden, no matter how deep it's buried. Maria Santos had always been the kind of person who lit up every room she entered. At 23, she possessed that rare combination of genuine kindness and fierce determination that made people naturally gravitate toward her. Her laugh was infectious, her smile could melt the hardest hearts, and her unwavering belief in doing the right thing had earned her both admiration and, unfortunately, some dangerous enemies. Working as a junior accountant at Millbrook's largest construction company, Santos & Associates, Maria had stumbled upon something that would cost her everything. It started innocently enough with a simple audit of the company's quarterly reports. As she meticulously went through the numbers, discrepancies began to emerge. Small amounts at first, barely noticeable to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. But Maria was always paying attention. The rain had been falling steadily for 3 days when Maria made her discovery. Sitting in her small office on the 3rd floor of the Santos & Associates building, she stared at her computer screen in disbelief. The numbers didn't lie. Someone had been systematically siphoning money from employee pension funds for over 2 years. The total amount stolen was staggering, nearly $3 million that belonged to hardworking people who trusted their employer to secure their futures. Her hands trembled as she printed out the evidence. Bank transfers, falsified documents, forged signatures, it was all there in black and white. But what made her blood run cold was the realization of who was behind it. The signatures on the authorization forms belonged to 5 people she had worked with every day for the past 3 years. 5 people she had considered mentors, colleagues, even friends. David Richardson, the company's chief financial officer, was a man in his early 50s who had always treated Maria like a daughter. His wife had died of cancer 2 years ago, and everyone knew he had been struggling financially with the medical bills. But stealing from employee pensions was unforgivable, no matter the circumstances. Jennifer Walsh, the head of human resources, had been Maria's champion since day one. She had personally recommended Maria for her current position and had always been available for advice and support. The thought that Jennifer could be involved in something so corrupt made Maria's stomach turn. Marcus Thompson, the senior accountant, had been Maria's direct supervisor and the person who had taught her everything she knew about the company's financial systems. His signature appeared on more authorization forms than anyone else's. Sarah Mitchell, the company's legal counsel, had seemed like the most ethical person in the building. Her involvement suggested that the theft had been carefully planned to avoid legal complications. Finally, there was Robert Santos himself, the company's founder and president. His signature was on the final authorization for every stolen penny. The man whose name was on the building, whose family had built this business from nothing, was stealing from his own employees. Maria stared at the document spread across her desk as the rain continued to pound against her office window. She knew she held enough evidence to destroy 5 careers and send 5 people to prison. More importantly, she held the key to returning nearly $3 million to the people who rightfully owned it. The smart thing to do would be to take the evidence straight to the police. But Maria's conscience wouldn't let her take that step without giving the perpetrators a chance to explain themselves. Maybe there was some explanation she was missing. Maybe there was a way to resolve this quietly and return the money without destroying so many lives. That Tuesday evening, Maria decided to confront them. She had seen all 5 working late in the conference room on the 2nd floor. Through the glass walls, she could see them huddled around the large mahogany table. Documents spread everywhere, their faces serious and stressed. They seemed to be having some kind of crisis meeting. Maria gathered her evidence, placed it in a manila folder, and walked down to the second floor. Her heart was pounding as she approached the conference room. Through the glass, she could see David pacing back and forth while the others sat in tense silence. Jennifer was nervously tapping her pen against the table. Marcus was staring at his laptop screen with a grim expression. Sarah was reviewing legal documents with intense concentration. Robert was standing at the window looking out at the rain-soaked parking lot. She knocked on the glass door and entered when David gestured for her to come in. The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension, and she immediately sensed that her arrival was not welcome. "Maria," Robert said, turning from the window, "this is not a good time. We're dealing with some urgent business matters." "I know," Maria replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "That's actually why I'm here. I've been working on the quarterly audit, and I found some irregularities that I think you should know about." The room fell silent. The 5 conspirators exchanged glances that Maria couldn't quite interpret, but the tension in the room seemed to spike dramatically. "What kind of irregularities?" Jennifer asked, her voice carefully controlled. Maria opened her folder and placed copies of the most damning documents on the table. Unauthorized transfers from the Employee Pension Fund. Nearly $3 million over the past 2 years, all with forged authorization signatures. The silence that followed was deafening. Maria watched as the color drained from David's face, as Jennifer's hand froze mid-tap, as Marcus slowly closed his laptop, as Sarah stopped reading and looked up with fear in her eyes, as Robert turned from the window with an expression she had never seen before. "Maria," Robert said quietly, "you don't understand the situation." "Then help me understand," she replied. "Help me understand how 5 people I respect and trust could steal from their own employees. Help me understand how you could take money from people who depend on their pensions to survive." David stopped pacing and sat down heavily in his chair. "My wife's medical bills," he said quietly. "We lost our house. I lost everything. I was desperate. We all had our reasons," Jennifer added. "The company was struggling. We thought we could replace the money before anyone noticed." "But you didn't," Maria said firmly. "And now hardworking people are going to retire with nothing because you decided their security was worth less than your problems." Marcus leaned forward. "Maria, you're young. You don't understand how complicated life can get. Sometimes you have to make impossible choices." "There's nothing complicated about theft," Maria replied. "This is black and white. You stole money that doesn't belong to you." Sarah cleared her throat. "What do you intend to do with this information?"
Maria looked around the room at the 5 faces staring at her.
These were people she had worked with, laughed with, learned from. But they were also thieves who had betrayed the trust of dozens of innocent employees. "I want you to return the money," she said. "All of it. And I want you to confess what you've done. If you do that, maybe we can find a way to handle this that doesn't destroy everyone's lives." Robert walked over to the table and sat down across from Maria. "And if we refuse? Then I'll take this evidence to the police tomorrow morning," Maria said without hesitation. The 5 conspirators looked at each other with expressions of panic and desperation. Maria could practically see the wheels turning in their heads as they tried to figure out how to handle this unexpected complication. "We need time to think," Robert said finally. "This is a big decision." "You have until tomorrow morning," Maria replied, standing up and gathering her papers. "I'll be in my office at 8 o'clock. I expect an answer then." As Maria walked toward the door, she heard David call her name. She turned back to see all 5 of them staring at her with expressions she couldn't quite read. "Maria," David said softly, "you're making a mistake. Some things are better left alone." "The only mistake would be staying silent," she replied, and walked out of the conference room. Maria returned to her office, gathered her things, and prepared to leave for the evening. The building was mostly empty except for the 5 people in the conference room and a few other employees working late. She could hear muffled voices coming from the second floor as she waited for the elevator, but she couldn't make out what was being said. The rain was still falling when Maria reached the parking garage. The concrete structure was dimly lit and mostly empty at this hour. Her car was parked on the 3rd level, and she had to walk past several empty spaces to reach it. The sound of her heels echoing off the concrete walls seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. As she reached for her car door handle, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see Marcus Thompson approaching, his face serious and troubled. "Maria, wait," he called out. "We need to talk." We can talk tomorrow morning, she replied, unlocking her car door. No, we need to talk now, Marcus said, moving closer. You don't understand what you're getting involved in. Before Maria could respond, she heard more footsteps. David, Jennifer, Sarah, and Robert emerged from behind the concrete pillars surrounding her car. Their faces were no longer friendly or familiar. They looked desperate, dangerous. Get in the car, Maria, Robert said quietly. We're going to take a drive and have a proper conversation about this situation. I'm not going anywhere with you, Maria replied, her hand on a car door handle. Yes, you are, Jennifer said, producing a small handgun from her purse. Because if you don't, this conversation ends very badly for everyone involved. Maria's heart began to race as she realized the gravity of her situation. These people, whom she had trusted and respected, were now threatening her life to protect their secret. She looked around the parking garage, hoping to see another employee or security guard, but they were completely alone. You're making a terrible mistake, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. People know where I am. If something happens to me, they'll know who to look for. No one knows you're here, David said. We checked the building log. You're the last person to leave tonight. The evidence is already copied, Maria lied desperately. If something happens to me, it will automatically be sent to the police.
We'll take that chance,
Sarah said coldly. Get in the car. Maria realized she had two choices: comply and hope they would let her go after their conversation, or run and risk being shot in the parking garage. She chose a third option. Okay, she said, opening her car door, but I'm driving. No, Robert said. Marcus is driving. You're riding in the back seat with Jennifer and Sarah. As Maria reluctantly moved away from the driver's side, she palmed her cell phone and quickly sent a text message to her sister. Working late tonight. If you don't hear from me by morning, check the office. It wasn't much, but it was something. Jennifer kept the gun trained on Maria as they arranged themselves in the car. Marcus got behind the wheel, David sat in the passenger seat, and Maria found herself squeezed between Jennifer and Sarah in the back seat. Where are we going? Maria asked as Marcus started the engine. Somewhere quiet where we can talk without interruption, Robert replied. They drove in tense silence through the rain-soaked streets of Millbrook. Maria watched the familiar landmarks pass by the windows and tried to memorize the route they were taking. They were heading toward the industrial district on the outskirts of town, where the old abandoned warehouses stood like monuments to better economic times. The car pulled into the parking lot of a defunct manufacturing plant that had been closed for over a decade. The building was dark and isolated, surrounded by overgrown weeds and rusted chain-link fencing. This was not the kind of place where people came to have conversations. Get out, Jennifer said, pressing the gun against Maria's ribs. They walked toward the building through the driving rain, their shoes splashing through puddles and mud. David produced a key from his pocket and unlocked a side door that led into the main warehouse space. Inside, the building was dark except for the dim light filtering through broken windows. The air smelled of rust, decay, and abandonment. Their footsteps echoed off the concrete floor as they made their way deeper into the building. This is far enough, Robert said finally. They stopped in the center of the warehouse, surrounded by empty space and shadows. Maria could hear the rain pounding on the metal roof high above them. Now, Robert continued, let's discuss your future with the company. There's nothing to discuss, Maria replied, trying to project more confidence than she felt. You stole money from innocent people. I found out. You need to return it and face the consequences. The consequences? David repeated bitterly. Do you have any idea what those consequences would be? Prison? Disgrace. The destruction of everything we've worked for. You should have thought about that before you decided to become thieves, Maria shot back. Jennifer raised the gun and pointed it directly at Maria's face. You self-righteous little bitch. You think you're so much better than us. You think your principles matter more than our lives. My principles matter more than your crimes, Maria replied without flinching. Here's what's going to happen, Robert said, his voice taking on a business-like tone. You're going to destroy all the evidence you've gathered. You're going to forget what you found. You're going to continue working at the company as if nothing happened. And you're going to keep your mouth shut for the rest of your life. And if I refuse? Maria asked. Then you're not leaving this warehouse, Sarah said matter-of-factly. Maria looked around at the 5 faces staring at her. People she had worked with, people she had trusted, people she had considered friends. Now they were willing to kill her to protect their secret. You're all insane, she said quietly. You're talking about murder. Do you understand that? You're talking about killing someone to cover up theft. We're talking about survival. Marcus replied. "We're talking about protecting our families, our futures, our lives. By destroying mine," Maria said. The conversation continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The 5 conspirators took turns trying to convince, threaten, and intimidate Maria into compliance. They offered her money, promised her promotions, threatened her family, and described in detail what would happen to her if she refused to cooperate. Through it all, Maria remained steadfast. She would not be bought, threatened, or intimidated into silence. The money belonged to the employees, and she would not be part of covering up its theft. Finally, Robert looked at the others and nodded slightly. Maria saw Jennifer's grip tighten on the gun. "You've made your choice," Robert said sadly, "and we've made ours." What happened next would be debated by investigators, but the physical evidence told a clear story. Maria Santos died in that abandoned warehouse on a rainy Tuesday night in October. Her body was found 3 days later by a security guard making his rounds. The official cause of death was ruled accidental. The 5 conspirators had crafted an elaborate story about Maria slipping and hitting her head while they were all touring the property for a potential business venture. They claimed they had panicked and fled the scene, then spent days agonizing over whether to come forward. Their story had holes, but not enough holes to support murder charges. Without witnesses or clear evidence of foul play, the police were forced to accept the accidental death ruling. Maria's family was devastated, but not surprised by the official conclusion. They had always known Maria was careful and sure-footed, but accidents happen. They grieved their loss and tried to find peace with the idea that sometimes tragedy strikes without warning or reason. The 5 conspirators returned to work, destroyed all evidence of their theft, and gradually began to believe they had gotten away with both crimes. The pension fund discrepancies were quietly corrected using company reserves, and life in Millbrook returned to normal. But Maria Santos was not ready to rest in peace. 3 months after Maria Santos was buried in Millbrook's Greenwood Cemetery, David Richardson thought he was finally beginning to heal from the trauma of that terrible night. The official investigation had concluded, the insurance claims had been processed, and life at Santos & Associates had returned to its normal rhythm. David had even managed to sleep through the night without waking up in cold sweats, reliving those final moments in the abandoned warehouse. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Thursday morning in January. David was sitting in his office reviewing the quarterly budget reports when he heard a familiar sound that made his blood freeze. Someone was laughing. Not just any laugh, but Maria's laugh. The same bright, infectious giggle that used to echo through the hallways of Santos & Associates. He looked up from his computer and listened carefully. The office was quiet except for the usual sounds of keyboards clicking, phones ringing, and muffled conversations. He must have imagined it. Stress and guilt could play tricks on a person's mind. But then he heard it again. Clearer this time, coming from somewhere in the vicinity of Maria's old office on the 3rd floor. David's hands began to shake as he tried to convince himself that one of the new employees must have a similar laugh. It was the only rational explanation. He forced himself to focus on his work for the next hour, but the sound haunted him. Every few minutes he would hear that laugh drifting through the office, always seeming to come from just around the corner or just down the hallway. But whenever he looked up or walked to investigate, he saw nothing unusual. By lunchtime, David was a nervous wreck. He decided to take a walk around the building to clear his head and prove to himself that his imagination was playing tricks on him. He started on the ground floor and worked his way up, checking each office and cubicle. The 1st and 2nd floors were perfectly normal. Employees were working at their desks, having meetings in conference rooms, chatting by the coffee machine. No one seemed to have heard anything unusual. No one mentioned any new employee with a distinctive laugh. When David reached the 3rd floor, his heart began to pound. Maria's old office had been cleaned out months ago, and they had been using it for storage while searching for her replacement. The door should have been locked, and the room should have been empty, except for boxes of files and unused furniture. But as David approached the office, he could see light coming from under the door. Fluorescent light, as if someone was working inside. He could hear the soft clicking of computer keys and the occasional rustle of paper. His hand trembled as he reached for the door handle. He told himself that one of the maintenance staff must be organizing the storage, or perhaps someone from IT was working on the computer network. There had to be a rational explanation. The door opened easily, which surprised him, since it was supposed to be locked. Inside, the office looked exactly as it had when Maria was alive. Her desk was clear and organized, her computer was humming quietly, her favorite coffee mug was sitting beside her keyboard, still warm to the touch. The motivational posters she had hung on the walls were back in their original positions. Even the small succulent plant she had kept on her windowsill was there, green and healthy, as if someone had been watering it regularly. But the office was empty. No one was sitting at the desk. No one was standing by the filing cabinets. No one was there at all. David stood in the doorway, his heart hammering in his chest, trying to process what he was seeing. This was impossible. The office had been cleaned out. Maria's belongings had been returned to her family. The furniture had been moved to storage. The computer had been disconnected and removed. He stepped into the room and approached the desk. The computer screen was displaying a spreadsheet that looked exactly like the audit report Maria had been working on the night she died. The same columns, the same numbers, the same highlighted discrepancies that had led to their confrontation. But this was impossible, because all of Maria's files had been deleted from the company servers months ago. David reached out to touch the keyboard, and the moment his fingers made contact, the computer screen flickered and changed. Instead of the spreadsheet, a message appeared in large, bold letters. "I know what you did." David jerked his hand back as if the keyboard had burned him. He stared at the screen in shock and terror. This had to be someone's idea of a sick joke. One of the other conspirators must be playing games with him, trying to scare him into confessing. He quickly looked around the office for hidden cameras or recording devices, but found nothing. He checked the computer's network connections and discovered that the machine wasn't even plugged into the wall. It was running on battery power, which should have died months ago. As David stood there trying to make sense of what he was seeing, he heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, measured steps that seemed to be approaching the office. He moved to the doorway and looked out, expecting to see a colleague or maintenance worker. The hallway was empty, but the footsteps continued. They seemed to be getting closer, echoing off the walls in the same rhythm as Maria's walk. David remembered how she used to pace the halls when she was thinking through a difficult problem, always taking the same measured steps, always maintaining the same steady rhythm. The footsteps stopped directly outside the office door. David could feel a presence in the hallway, as if someone was standing just beyond his line of sight. The air seemed to grow cold, and he could see his breath forming small clouds in front of his face. "Maria," he whispered, not sure why he said her name or what he expected to happen. The temperature in the office plummeted. The fluorescent lights began to flicker and dim. The computer screen went black, then displayed a new message. "You killed me." David stumbled backward, knocking over Maria's chair in his panic. He ran from the office, slamming the door behind him, and didn't stop until he reached his car in the parking garage. His hands were shaking so badly that he could barely get the key into the ignition. That night, David went home to his empty house and tried to convince himself that what he had experienced was a stress-induced hallucination. He had been carrying enormous guilt for months, and his subconscious mind had finally found a way to torment him with it. There had to be a psychological explanation for everything he had seen and heard. He made himself a strong drink and sat in his living room, trying to relax and think rationally about the situation. Ghosts weren't real. Dead people didn't come back to haunt their killers. There had to be a logical explanation for what had happened at the office. But as David sat there trying to rationalize his experience, he began to notice that something was wrong with his house. The temperature kept dropping, even though his thermostat was set to 75 degrees. He could see his breath in the living room, and frost was beginning to form on the windows. Then he heard the typing. The sound was coming from his home office, a small room off the main hallway where he kept his personal computer and files. It was the distinctive sound of someone typing rapidly on a mechanical keyboard, the same type of keyboard Maria had used at work. David crept down the hallway toward his office, his heart pounding with each step. The door was closed, but he could see light spilling out from underneath it, not the warm glow of his desk lamp, but the harsh glare of fluorescent lighting that didn't exist in his home office. He pressed his ear to the door and listened. The typing continued, accompanied by the occasional sound of papers being shuffled and the click of a computer mouse. Someone was definitely in there, working at his desk. David slowly opened the door and peered inside. His office looked completely different. Instead of his comfortable home setup with warm lighting and personal decorations, it now looked exactly like Maria's office at Santos & Associates. The same furniture, the same posters on the walls, the same succulent plant on the windowsill. Sitting at his desk, typing on his computer, was Maria Santos. She looked exactly as she had in life, wearing the same blue business suit she had worn on the day she died. Her long dark hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and her face was focused on the computer screen with the same intense concentration she had always brought to her work. David stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move or speak. This was impossible. Maria was dead. He had been there when she died. He had helped carry her body out of that warehouse. He had attended her funeral. As if sensing his presence, Maria looked up from the computer and turned to face him. Her eyes, which had always been warm and full of life, now burned with cold fury. When she spoke, her voice was exactly as he remembered it, but filled with an anger that made his blood freeze. "Hello, David," she said calmly. "We need to finish our conversation." David tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He tried to speak, but no words would come. He could only stand there and stare at the impossible sight of Maria Santos, alive and angry, sitting at his desk. "You thought you could kill me and walk away," Maria continued, standing up from the chair. "You thought you could steal from innocent people and cover it up with murder. You thought you were so clever." "You're not real," David finally managed to whisper. "You're dead. I watched you die." "Yes, you did," Maria replied, taking a step toward him. "You watched me die, and then you helped cover it up. You told lies to the police. You helped create a false story about my death. You thought you had gotten away with it." "It was an accident," David said desperately. "We never meant for anyone to get hurt." "We just wanted you to stay quiet about the money." "It wasn't an accident when you decided to steal from the pension fund," Maria said, taking another step closer. "It wasn't an accident when you brought a gun to threaten me. It wasn't an accident when you decided to kill me rather than face the consequences of your actions." David backed out of the office and ran toward his front door, but when he reached for the handle, it wouldn't turn. The door was locked from the inside. Even though he hadn't locked it, he yanked on the handle frantically, but it wouldn't budge. "You can't run from what you've done, David." Maria's voice came from directly behind him. He spun around to see her standing in the hallway, no longer looking entirely human. Her skin was pale and translucent, and her eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. "The money you stole belonged to people who trusted you," she continued. "Mrs. Peterson, who cleaned offices for 30 years and was counting on her pension to pay for her medications. Mr. Bow Johnson, who worked construction his whole life and just wanted to retire with dignity. The Martinez family, who immigrated here with nothing and worked so hard to build a future for their children. We put the money back," David said desperately. "We replaced everything. No one lost anything. Everyone lost something," Maria replied. "They lost their trust. They lost their sense of security. They lost their faith in the people who were supposed to protect them. And I lost my life." David sank to his knees in front of the locked door, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry. We never wanted it to go that far. We were desperate, scared. We made terrible decisions." "Sorry isn't enough," Maria said, kneeling down beside him. When she spoke again, her voice was so close to his ear that he could feel her cold breath on his neck. "Sorry doesn't bring back the dead. Sorry doesn't undo murder." "What do you want from me?" David asked. "I want justice," Maria replied. "I want the truth to come out. I want the people responsible to face the consequences of their actions." "The statute of limitations," David began, but Maria cut him off. "There's no statute of limitations on murder," she said. "And there's no statute of limitations on what I can do to you." The temperature in David's house continued to drop. Ice began forming on the walls and ceiling. The lights flickered and went out, leaving them in darkness except for the unnatural glow emanating from Maria's form. "This is just the beginning, David," she said as she began to fade away. "I'm going to visit each of you. I'm going to remind you of what you did. And I'm going to make sure you never have another peaceful moment for the rest of your lives." As Maria disappeared, the temperature returned to normal and the lights came back on. David found himself alone in his hallway, on his knees in front of a door that now opened easily. He spent the rest of the night sitting in his living room, drinking and trying to convince himself that what he had experienced was a hallucination brought on by guilt and stress. But deep down, he knew the truth. Maria Santos had found a way to return from the dead, and she was coming for all of them. The next morning, David called in sick to work. He couldn't face going back to the office, couldn't risk encountering Maria's ghost again. But as the day wore on, he realized that staying home wasn't going to protect him. Maria had found him at his house just as easily as she had found him at the office. By evening, David was a nervous wreck. He jumped at every sound, checked and rechecked all the locks on his doors and windows, and left every light in the house burning bright. But none of it helped. As night fell, the temperature began to drop again, and David knew that Maria was coming back. This time, she appeared in his bedroom while he was trying to sleep. David woke up to find her standing at the foot of his bed, staring down at him with those glowing, angry eyes. "Did you think I was finished with you?" she asked. David pulled the covers up to his chin, like a child hiding from monsters. "Please," he whispered. "I can't take this anymore. Tell me what you want me to do." "Confess," Maria said simply. "Tell the police what really happened. Tell my family the truth. Face the consequences of your actions like an adult." "I can't," David replied. "It would destroy my life. I'd go to prison. I'd lose everything." "You already lost everything when you decided to become a murderer," Maria said. "The only question now is whether you're going to do the right thing voluntarily or whether I'm going to have to force you."
How can you force me?
David asked. "You're dead. You're just a ghost." Maria smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression David had ever seen. "You have no idea what the dead can do to the living when they're properly motivated," she said. Over the next week, David's life became a living nightmare. Maria appeared to him at random times throughout the day and night. Sometimes she would simply stand in a corner and stare at him. Sometimes she would whisper accusations and threats in his ear. Sometimes she would manipulate objects around him, making them move or break in ways that defied explanation. The worst part was that no one else could see or hear her. When David tried to tell his doctor about his experiences, he was prescribed antipsychotic medication. When he tried to confide in a coworker, they suggested he take some time off to deal with his stress. When he called a priest to perform an exorcism, he was told that the Catholic Church didn't perform such rituals without extensive investigation and evidence of actual supernatural activity. David was trapped in his own personal hell, tormented by the ghost of the woman he had helped murder, with no way to escape and no one who would believe his story. He stopped going to work, stopped leaving his house, and spent his days drinking and waiting for Maria's next visit. But Maria wasn't finished with just David. She had 4 more people to visit, 4 more conspirators to confront. And unlike David, who had been racked with guilt since the night of the murder, the others had managed to convince themselves that they were innocent victims of circumstances beyond their control. They were about to learn that some circumstances follow you beyond the grave. Jennifer Walsh had always prided herself on being the most composed member of the group. As the head of human resources, she was accustomed to dealing with difficult situations, managing crises, and maintaining her professional demeanor under pressure. While David Richardson was falling apart at the seams, Jennifer convinced herself that she was handling the aftermath of Maria's death with remarkable strength and resilience. She had noticed David's increasingly erratic behavior over the past few weeks. He had been calling in sick frequently, looking haggard and exhausted when he did show up for work, and jumping at shadows like a man on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Jennifer assumed he was struggling with guilt, and she had even suggested that he seek professional help to deal with his stress. What Jennifer didn't realize was that she was about to face her own reckoning. The first sign came on a Monday morning in February, exactly 4 months after Maria's death. Jennifer was conducting her weekly staff meeting with her HR team when one of her assistants mentioned that they had received a peculiar phone call over the weekend. "Someone called asking about Maria Santos," the assistant said, consulting her notes. "They wanted to know about her employment history, her performance reviews, that sort of thing. I told them that we don't release that information without proper authorization, but they insisted they had the right to access her files." Jennifer's blood ran cold. "Did they give you a name? Did they say who they were or why they needed the information?" "That's the strange part," the assistant replied. The voice sounded just like Maria. Same tone, same accent, same way of speaking. For a moment, I actually thought someone was playing a recording of her voice. But that's impossible, right? Jennifer forced herself to smile and nod calmly. "Of course it's impossible. It was probably just someone with a similar voice." "Did they leave a callback number?" "No, they hung up when I asked for identification. But the caller ID showed that the call came from inside the building, extension 3247. Jennifer's heart skipped a beat. Extension 30247 was Maria's old office phone number, the phone that had been disconnected months ago when they cleaned out her office and converted it to storage space. "That can't be right," Jennifer said, trying to keep her voice steady. "That extension hasn't been active since October. There must be some mistake with the phone system." After the meeting, Jennifer went directly to the IT department to inquire about the phone records. The technician confirmed that extension 3247 had indeed been disconnected in November, but the system showed that a call had been made from that number over the weekend. The technician was puzzled and promised to investigate the anomaly. Jennifer spent the rest of the day trying to focus on her work, but she couldn't stop thinking about the phone call. Someone was playing games with them, trying to scare them into confessing what they had done. It had to be someone who knew about Maria's death and was trying to capitalize on their guilt. But who could it be? The 5 conspirators had been careful to keep their secret contained. No one else knew what had really happened in that warehouse. Unless one of the group was betraying the others, trying to frighten them into confession to save his own skin. As the workday ended and the office began to empty, Jennifer decided to investigate Maria's old office herself. She needed to see if someone had somehow reactivated the phone line or if there was evidence that someone had been using the space to stage their psychological warfare. The 3rd floor was quiet and dimly lit as Jennifer made her way down the hallway. Most of the offices were empty, their occupants having gone home for the day. The only sounds were the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant noise of traffic from the street below. Maria's old office was at the end of the hall and the door was closed just as it should be. Jennifer had personally supervised the cleaning and conversion of the space, and she knew exactly what should be inside: boxes of old files, unused furniture, and computer equipment waiting to be reassigned. She unlocked the door with her master key and stepped inside, reaching for the light switch. But when the fluorescent lights flickered to life, Jennifer gasped in shock and horror. The office looked exactly as it had when Maria was alive. The desk was in its original position, clean and organized, with Maria's personal touches restored. The computer was humming quietly, its screen displaying what appeared to be active spreadsheets. The motivational posters were back on the walls in their exact original locations. Even Maria's favorite coffee mug was sitting on the desk, still warm to the touch. Jennifer stood in the doorway, her mind racing to find a rational explanation for what she was seeing. Someone had obviously restored the office to its original state, but why? And how had they managed to do it without anyone noticing? She approached the desk cautiously, looking for clues about who might be responsible for this elaborate setup. The computer screen showed financial documents that looked familiar, spreadsheets that resembled the audit work Maria had been doing before her death. As Jennifer leaned closer to examine the documents, the phone on the desk began to ring. The sound was sharp and jarring in the quiet office, and it made Jennifer jump backward in surprise. The caller ID display showed internal call with no extension number listed. Against her better judgment, Jennifer picked up the phone. "Hello?" she said tentatively. "Hello, Jennifer." The voice on the other end was unmistakably Maria's, the same warm tone, the same slight accent, the same inflection patterns that Jennifer remembered so well. Jennifer slammed the phone down and staggered backward, her heart pounding in her chest. This was impossible. Maria was dead. Jennifer had been there when she died. She had helped stage the scene to make it look like an accident. But the phone rang again, and again. Each time Jennifer ignored it, but the ringing seemed to get louder and more insistent. Finally, unable to stand the noise any longer, she picked up the receiver again. "What do you want?" she whispered. "I want to finish our conversation," Maria's voice replied. "The one we started in the warehouse." "You're dead," Jennifer said, her voice shaking. "This isn't real. Someone is playing games using recordings of your voice." "Am I dead, Jennifer? Are you sure about that?" As Maria spoke, the temperature in the office began to drop rapidly. Jennifer could see her breath forming clouds in front of her face, and frost began to appear on the windows. "Look at the computer screen," Maria's voice instructed. Jennifer looked at the monitor and saw that it was now displaying a document she recognized with growing horror. It was the incident report she had filed with the insurance company, describing Maria's death as an accidental fall during a routine building inspection. But as Jennifer watched, the text began to change. Words disappeared and new ones appeared, as if an invisible hand was editing the document in real time. The accidental death report was being transformed into a confession of murder. "Stop," Jennifer whispered into the phone. "Please stop." "I can't stop," Maria's voice replied. "I'm dead, remember? Dead people don't have the luxury of stopping. Dead people don't get to move on with their lives. Dead people don't get to pretend that nothing happened." The editing continued, and soon the document contained a detailed confession describing exactly how Maria had been murdered and by whom. Every detail was accurate, every fact was correct. It was as if Maria herself was dictating her own death report. "How are you doing this?" Jennifer asked. "Death has its advantages," Maria replied. "I can see things now that I couldn't see when I was alive. I can access places I couldn't access before. I can reach people in ways that the living never could." Jennifer tried to leave the office, but when she reached for the door handle, it wouldn't turn. She was trapped inside with the impossibly restored office and the ghost of the woman she had helped murder. "Let me out," she demanded. "Why should I?" Maria asked. "You didn't let me out of that warehouse. You didn't let me walk away when I threatened to expose your crimes. Why should I extend you a courtesy that you denied me? Jennifer began to panic. She pulled on the door handle with all her strength, but it remained firmly locked. She pounded on the door and shouted for help, but no sound seemed to escape the room. It was as if the office had become completely isolated from the rest of the world. No one can hear you, Maria's voice confirmed. Just like no one could hear me in that warehouse when I begged you to let me go. Jennifer collapsed into the chair in front of Maria's desk, tears streaming down her face. We never wanted to hurt you, she sobbed. We were desperate. We had made terrible mistakes and we didn't know how to fix them. So you decided to make a worse mistake, Maria's voice replied. You decided that murder was preferable to taking responsibility for theft.
It wasn't supposed to happen that way, Jennifer continued.
We just wanted to scare you into keeping quiet. The gun was only supposed to be a threat. But when I refused to be intimidated, you pulled the trigger. Jennifer looked up at the computer screen and saw that it was now displaying crime scene photos from the warehouse. Photos that the police had taken, photos that supposedly showed an accidental death. But now the images seemed to tell a different story. Now Jennifer could see the evidence of violence that had been overlooked or explained away during the official investigation. The police believed our story, Jennifer said desperately. They ruled it an accident. The case is closed. Cases can be reopened, Maria's voice replied. Especially when new evidence comes to light. Especially when witnesses come forward. Especially when the guilty parties confess. Over the next hour, Jennifer was subjected to a psychological torture that made David's experiences seem mild by comparison. Maria forced her to relive every detail of that night in the warehouse, to confront every lie she had told to cover up the murder, to face the full weight of her guilt and responsibility. The ghost showed her images of Maria's family grieving at her funeral. She made Jennifer listen to recordings of Maria's mother crying and wondering why her daughter had to die so young. She displayed financial records showing how Maria's death had affected her family's economic situation, how they had struggled to pay for the funeral and deal with the loss of her income. This is what you did, Maria's voice said, as the horrible images continued to flash across the computer screen. This is the pain you caused. This is the destruction you created when you decided that your secrets were more important than my life. Jennifer begged for forgiveness, promised to confess everything, swore that she would make things right somehow. But Maria was not interested in promises or pleas. It's too late for words, the ghost said. It's time for action. It's time for justice. When Jennifer finally managed to leave the office hours later, she was a broken woman. Like David, she stopped coming to work regularly. She began drinking heavily and avoiding contact with friends and colleagues. She lived in constant fear of Maria's next visit, jumping at every sound and seeing Maria's face in every shadow. But Maria's campaign of supernatural justice was far from over. She still had 3 more conspirators to visit, 3 more people who needed to be reminded of what they had done and forced to face the consequences of their actions. Marcus Thompson was next on her list. As Maria's former supervisor and the person who had taught her everything she knew about the company's financial systems, Marcus bore a special responsibility for the betrayal of trust that had led to her death. He had been like a father figure to Maria, and his participation in the conspiracy had hurt her more deeply than the others. Marcus had always been the most analytical member of the group, and he approached the situation with his accountant's mind. He had convinced himself that their actions were justified by the circumstances, and that they had simply made the best of a bad situation. Unlike David and Jennifer, who were consumed by guilt, Marcus had rationalized their behavior as a necessary evil. He noticed David's breakdown and Jennifer's increasingly erratic behavior, but he attributed their problems to weak constitutions and guilty consciences. Marcus prided himself on being stronger than that, more practical, more focused on solutions rather than regrets. He was about to learn that practical thinking wouldn't protect him from the wrath of the dead. Marcus's first encounter with Maria's ghost occurred in his own home, while he was working late one evening on tax preparation for several of his private clients. He had converted his spare bedroom into a home office, complete with multiple monitors, high-speed internet, and all the latest accounting software. He was deep in concentration, working through a complex depreciation schedule, when he heard typing coming from somewhere else in the house. At first, he thought it might be his wife working on her laptop in the living room, but when he called out to her, she reminded him that she was at her book club meeting and wouldn't be home for another 2 hours. The typing continued, steady and rhythmic, coming from what sounded like his kitchen. Marcus saved his work and went to investigate, expecting to find that he had left his laptop running or that one of his devices was updating automatically. But when he entered the kitchen, he found something that defied all logical explanation. Sitting at his kitchen table, typing on an old-fashioned manual typewriter that definitely didn't belong to him, was Maria Santos. She was wearing the same blue business suit she had worn on the day she died, and she was focused intently on her work, her fingers moving rapidly across the keys. The typewriter was producing page after page of what appeared to be financial documents, numbers and calculations filling sheet after sheet of paper. Marcus stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move or speak. This had to be a hallucination, a stress-induced breakdown similar to what David and Jennifer were apparently experiencing. There was no other rational explanation for what he was seeing. But Maria looked up from her typing and smiled at him, the same warm smile he remembered from their working relationship. "Hello, Marcus," she said in her familiar voice. "I hope you don't mind me using your kitchen. I have some work to catch up on." "You're not real," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm as real as the numbers in these financial statements," Maria replied, gesturing to the papers scattered around the typewriter. "I'm as real as the pension money you helped steal. I'm as real as the bullet that killed me." Marcus forced himself to step into the kitchen and approach the table. The typewriter was definitely real, solid and heavy, with the distinctive smell of ink and metal. The papers were real too, covered with calculations and financial projections that looked like Maria's handwriting. But as Marcus looked more closely at the documents, he realized they weren't random financial statements. They were a detailed analysis of the pension fund theft, complete with transaction records, authorization codes, and forensic accounting techniques that could be used to prove the conspiracy in a court of law. "What are you doing?" Marcus asked. "I'm finishing the audit I started before you killed me," Maria replied, continuing to type. "I'm documenting every aspect of your criminal enterprise. Every stolen dollar, every forged signature, every lie you told to cover your tracks." "Why?" Marcus asked. "Because someone needs to know the truth," Maria said. "Because the people you stole from deserve justice. Because murder shouldn't be profitable." As Maria continued typing, the pages began to stack up around the typewriter. Hundreds of pages of evidence, documentation that could destroy all 5 conspirators if it ever reached the authorities. Marcus watched in fascination and horror as his life's work was dissected and exposed by the ghost of the woman he had helped murder. "You can't prove any of this," he said finally. "You're dead. Dead people can't testify in court. Dead people can't be witnesses. Dead people can do lots of things the living don't expect," Maria replied. "Dead people can access files that were deleted. Dead people can recover evidence that was destroyed. Dead people can reach places that the living can't go." As if to demonstrate her point, Maria reached into thin air and pulled out a stack of documents that Marcus recognized with growing alarm. They were the original authorization forms for the pension transfers, the ones they had thought were safely destroyed months ago. The papers looked exactly as they had on the day they were signed, complete with the original signatures and date stamps. "Where did you get those?" Marcus demanded. "Death has its privileges," Maria replied. "I can see everything now. I can access anything I need. I can recover what was lost and expose what was hidden." Over the next several hours, Maria subjected Marcus to the same psychological torture she had inflicted on David and Jennifer. She forced him to confront the full scope of their crimes, to acknowledge the harm they had caused to innocent people, to face the reality of what they had done to cover up their theft. But unlike the others, Marcus tried to argue with her, to justify their actions, to minimize their responsibility. He had always been good at finding loopholes and rationalizations, and he wasn't ready to give up that approach just because he was dealing with a ghost. The company was failing, he argued. If we hadn't taken that money, everyone would have lost their jobs. At least this way, the employees still have work. "Built on a foundation of lies and theft," Maria replied. "Built on my murder." "Your death was an accident," Marcus insisted. "We never intended for anyone to get hurt." "My death was murder," Maria corrected. "You brought a gun to intimidate me. You were prepared to use violence to protect your secret. When I refused to be intimidated, you followed through on your threat." The argument continued through the night, with Marcus trying to defend their actions and Maria systematically demolishing every justification he offered. By morning, Marcus was as broken and defeated as David and Jennifer, finally forced to confront the full weight of his guilt and responsibility. But Maria's work was still not finished. She had 2 more conspirators to visit. 2 more people who needed to be reminded of what they had done and forced to face the consequences of their actions. And unlike the others, who had been racked with guilt from the beginning, Her final two targets had managed to maintain their innocence and justify their behavior, even in the face of murder. They were about to learn that some justifications don't survive contact with the supernatural fury of the wrongly dead. Sarah Mitchell had built her entire career on the foundation of logic, evidence, and legal precedent. As the chief legal counsel for Santos & Associates, she was accustomed to dealing with complex problems through careful analysis and strategic thinking. Unlike her co-conspirators, who were succumbing to what she diagnosed as stress-induced psychological breakdowns, Sarah remained convinced that their secret was safe and that their actions had been legally justified under the circumstances. She had watched David Richardson deteriorate into a nervous wreck, calling in sick constantly and jumping at shadows when he did manage to show up for work. She had observed Jennifer Walsh's decline from composed HR professional to paranoid alcoholic who could barely function in meetings. She had noted Marcus Thompson's increasingly erratic behavior and his obsession with reviewing old financial documents as if he expected them to spontaneously combust. Sarah attributed all of these problems to guilt and weakness. As far as she was concerned, they had made the necessary decisions to protect themselves and the company from a devastating scandal. Maria Santos had been an unfortunate casualty of circumstances beyond their control, and her death had been ruled accidental by the proper authorities. The case was closed, legally and practically. What Sarah failed to understand was that some cases transcend the boundaries of legal jurisdiction. The first indication that something was wrong came on a Wednesday evening in March, exactly 5 months after Maria's death. Sarah was working late in her office, reviewing contracts for a major construction project, when she received a call from the courthouse security desk. "Miss Mitchell," the security guard said, "there's someone here asking about the Santos case. They claim to have new evidence that requires immediate legal review." Sarah's blood ran cold. The Santos case referred to the wrongful death lawsuit that Maria's family had filed against the company, claiming that inadequate safety protocols had led to their daughter's accidental death. The case had been settled out of court 3 months ago for a substantial but manageable sum, with all parties agreeing to confidentiality clauses. "What kind of evidence?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice professional. "They won't say," the guard replied. "They insist on speaking only with the lead counsel for the defense. They're very persistent. And frankly, they're making me nervous. They keep talking about justice and truth like they're on some kind of mission." "Did they give you a name?" Sarah asked. "That's the strange part," the guard said. "They claim to be Maria Santos. I told them that was impossible since the plaintiff in question is deceased, but they just smiled and said that death doesn't always end someone's legal standing." Sarah's hands began to shake as she processed this information. Someone was obviously playing games with them, using Maria's death to extract money or information from the company. It was probably one of Maria's family members, grief-stricken and looking for someone to blame for their loss. "I'll be right there," Sarah said. The courthouse was mostly empty at this hour, with only security personnel and a few attorneys working late on urgent cases. Sarah's footsteps echoed through the marble hallways as she made her way to the main entrance, where the security desk was located. The guard who had called her was a middle-aged man named Peterson, whom Sarah had known for years. He looked visibly shaken as she approached his desk. "Where is this person who claims to be Maria Santos?" Sarah asked. Peterson pointed toward the waiting area near the courthouse entrance. "Over there, by the windows." "But Miss Mitchell, I have to tell you, something's not right about this situation. I've been working security here for 15 years, and I've never encountered anything like this." Sarah looked toward the waiting area and saw a woman sitting alone on one of the wooden benches. The woman was wearing a blue business suit and had long dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. From a distance, she did indeed bear a striking resemblance to Maria Santos. "What's so unusual about her?" Sarah asked. Peterson lowered his voice to a whisper. "She didn't come through the metal detectors. She didn't sign the visitor log. She didn't show any identification. One minute the waiting area was empty, and the next minute she was just sitting there. It's like she appeared out of thin air." "That's impossible," Sarah said. "She must have come in while you were distracted or dealing with other visitors." "There haven't been any other visitors tonight," Peterson replied. "And I've been watching the entrance like a hawk since she called asking about the Santos case. She couldn't have gotten past me without my knowledge." Sarah approached the waiting area cautiously, studying the woman on the bench. As she got closer, her heart began to pound with recognition and terror. The woman didn't just resemble Maria Santos. She was Maria Santos, down to the smallest details of her appearance and mannerisms. "Ms. Mitchell," the woman said, looking up with a warm smile that Sarah remembered all too well. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I have some legal matters I'd like to discuss. Sarah stood frozen, staring at the impossible sight of a woman she had watched die 5 months earlier. This had to be some kind of elaborate hoax, a case of mistaken identity, or perhaps an actress hired by someone to impersonate the deceased. You're not Maria Santos, Sarah said firmly. Maria Santos is dead. Am I? The woman replied, tilting her head with the same curious expression Maria used to make when considering a complex problem. Are you absolutely certain about that? As a legal professional, shouldn't you examine all the evidence before reaching a conclusion? I was there when you died, Sarah said, her voice dropping to a whisper. I saw your body. I attended your funeral. Yes, you were there, Maria agreed. You were there when I died, and you were there when you helped cover up my murder. You were very helpful in crafting the legal strategy to make it look like an accident. Sarah looked around the courthouse lobby, hoping to see other people who could witness this impossible conversation. But except for Peterson at the security desk, they were alone. This isn't real, Sarah said, more to herself than to Maria. This is a stress reaction, a guilt-induced hallucination. If I'm just a hallucination, Maria said, standing up from the bench, then you won't mind if I show you something. Maria reached into her purse and pulled out a thick manila folder. She handed it to Sarah, who took it with trembling hands. Inside were documents that made Sarah's blood freeze. Legal briefs, witness statements, forensic reports, and photographic evidence that told the true story of what had happened in that warehouse. But these weren't copies of existing documents. These were new files, prepared with legal precision and attention to detail that would be admissible in any court. They contained evidence that Sarah knew had been destroyed, witness testimony that had never been given, and forensic analysis that had never been conducted. Where did you get these? Sarah asked. I've been busy since my death, Maria replied. Death has given me access to information and evidence that the living could never obtain. I can see through lies, recover destroyed documents, and access memories that people thought were safely hidden. Sarah flipped through the documents with growing horror and fascination. The legal case contained within this folder was airtight, comprehensive, and devastating. It would not only prove that Maria's death was murder, but it would also expose the entire pension fund conspiracy and demonstrate how the 5 conspirators had worked together to cover up both crimes. What do you want? Sarah asked. I want justice, Maria replied. I want the truth to be told. I want the people responsible for my death to face the legal consequences of their actions. The statute of limitations, Sarah began, but Maria cut her off with a laugh. There's no statute of limitations on murder, counselor. And there's no statute of limitations on what I can do to ensure that justice is served. As Maria spoke, the temperature in the courthouse lobby began to drop. Sarah could see her breath forming clouds in front of her face, and frost began to appear on the windows. The fluorescent lights began to flicker and dim, casting eerie shadows across the marble floors. This is impossible, Sarah whispered. Ghosts aren't real. The supernatural doesn't exist. The law recognizes many things that seem impossible, Maria replied. Corporations are considered persons under the law, even though they have no physical form. Intellectual property can be owned and transferred, even though it's intangible. Legal standing can extend beyond death through estates and wills. As Maria spoke, she began to change. Her appearance became less solid, more translucent. Her eyes began to glow with an otherworldly light. Her voice took on an echoing quality that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Maybe it's time for the law to recognize a new category, Maria continued. Maybe it's time to acknowledge that some victims refuse to stay silent, even in death. Sarah tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She tried to call for help, but no sound would come from her throat. She could only stand there and watch as Maria's ghost transformed into something far more terrifying than a simple apparition. You were my legal counsel, Maria said, her voice now filled with supernatural authority. You were supposed to protect me, to ensure that justice was served when crimes were committed. Instead, you helped my murderers escape consequences. The documents in Sarah's hands began to glow with an eerie light. The words on the pages seemed to move and shift, rearranging themselves into new configurations. Legal arguments appeared and disappeared. Evidence manifested and vanished. Witness statements wrote themselves in languages that Sarah didn't recognize but somehow understood perfectly. This is what you should have done, Maria said as the documents continued to change. This is the case you should have built. This is the justice you should have pursued. Sarah watched in fascination and terror as the ghost of Maria Santos demonstrated legal skills that surpassed anything she had learned in law school or developed in her professional career. Maria was crafting a case that was not only legally sound but also impossible to defend against, using evidence and arguments that transcended the normal boundaries of jurisprudence. "You can't practice law," Sarah said desperately. "You're not licensed. You're not even alive." "I'm practicing a higher law now," Maria replied. "I'm operating under a jurisdiction that supersedes your earthly courts. I'm seeking justice from a tribunal that can't be corrupted, intimidated, or deceived." For the next several hours, Sarah was subjected to a legal education unlike anything she had ever experienced. Maria showed her how the law could be used to serve justice rather than protect the guilty. She demonstrated how evidence could be gathered and preserved through supernatural means. She explained how witnesses could testify from beyond the grave, and how confessions could be extracted through methods that no earthly court would recognize. "This is insane," Sarah said finally. "This violates every principle of legal procedure and constitutional protection." "So does murder," Maria replied. "So does conspiracy to commit fraud. So does obstruction of justice. You didn't seem concerned about legal principles when you were helping to cover up my death." As dawn approached, Sarah found herself back in her office, alone and exhausted. The documents Maria had shown her were gone, but the memory of their contents remained vivid and terrifying. She knew that somehow, someway, Maria Santos had found a way to continue practicing law from beyond the grave, and she was building a case that would destroy all of them. Like the others, Sarah began to deteriorate rapidly after her encounter with Maria's ghost. She started making mistakes at work, missing deadlines, and providing inadequate legal advice to her clients. She began drinking heavily and avoiding social interactions. She lived in constant fear of Maria's next visit, knowing that the ghost was far from finished with her campaign of supernatural justice. But Maria still had one more conspirator to visit. Robert Santos, the company founder and president, the man whose name was on the building and whose signature was on every stolen penny. He was the leader of the conspiracy, the person most responsible for the decisions that had led to Maria's death. And unlike the others who had been gradually worn down by guilt and fear, Robert Santos remained confident that he had made the right choices and that their secret would remain safe forever. He had built his company from nothing, survived economic downturns and business crises, and always found a way to emerge victorious from every challenge. He was about to face his greatest challenge yet, and this time, victory was not an option. Robert had watched his co-conspirators fall apart one by one, but he attributed their problems to weakness and poor stress management. He had always been the strongest member of their group, the natural leader who made the difficult decisions that others couldn't or wouldn't make. He was convinced that Maria Santos was safely buried, and that their secret would die with them. He had no idea that some secrets refused to stay buried, and some victims refused to stay dead. The final reckoning was about to begin. Robert Santos had built his empire on a simple philosophy. Winners do whatever it takes to win, and losers make excuses. At 62 years old, he had spent 4 decades building Santos & Associates from a small family construction business into one of the most successful firms in the region. He had weathered economic recessions, business scandals, and personal tragedies with the same unwavering determination that had made him a millionaire several times over. The gradual collapse of his 4 co-conspirators didn't surprise or concern him. Robert had always known that David Richardson was weak, that Jennifer Walsh was too emotional, that Marcus Thompson was too analytical for his own good, and that Sarah Mitchell was too bound by legal technicalities to see the bigger picture. When the pressure mounted, he had expected them to crack. What surprised him was how quickly and completely they had fallen apart. David had stopped coming to work entirely, spending his days drinking and jumping at shadows. Jennifer had become a paranoid wreck who could barely function in professional settings. Marcus was obsessed with reviewing old financial documents as if they contained hidden messages. Sarah had started making elementary legal mistakes that suggested she was losing her grip on reality. Robert attributed all of these problems to guilty consciences and weak character. As far as he was concerned, they had made the necessary decisions to protect their company, their employees, and their families from financial ruin. Maria Santos had been a regrettable casualty, but her death had been an accident, not murder. The fact that they had covered up the circumstances was simply good business sense. He had no idea that Maria Santos was systematically destroying his co-conspirators through supernatural means, or that she was saving him for last because he bore the greatest responsibility for her death. He was about to learn that some business decisions have consequences that extend far beyond the quarterly profit reports. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Thursday evening in April, exactly 6 months after Maria's death. Robert was working late in his corner office, reviewing plans for a major downtown development project, when his secretary buzzed him on the intercom. "Mr. Santos," she said, "there's someone here to see you. She says she has an appointment, but I don't have anything on your calendar." "Who is it?" Robert asked, not looking up from his blueprints. "She says her name is Maria Santos. She claims to be a new employee, but I've never seen her before. She's very insistent about meeting with you tonight." Robert's blood ran. There were 3 Maria Santos currently employed by his company, which was not unusual given how common the name was in their community. But something about his secretary's tone suggested that this wasn't a simple case of mistaken identity. "What does she look like?" he asked. "She's young, maybe mid-20s, wearing a blue business suit, long dark hair and a ponytail. She seems very professional, but there's something strange about her. She appeared in the lobby without signing in, and security doesn't have any record of her entering the building." Robert's hands began to shake as he processed this information. It couldn't be the Maria Santos he was thinking of. That Maria Santos was dead and buried. This had to be a coincidence, perhaps a new employee with the same name who had somehow gotten confused about appointment schedules. "Send her in," he said finally. Robert tried to focus on his blueprints while waiting for his visitor, but his mind kept racing with possibilities and fears. The other conspirators had been acting increasingly strange over the past few months, talking about impossible encounters and supernatural experiences. Maybe their paranoia was finally getting to him as well. The door to his office opened, and a young woman walked in, wearing a blue business suit with her dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. She looked exactly like the Maria Santos who had worked for his company until 6 months ago. She looked exactly like the Maria Santos who had discovered their theft and threatened to expose them. She looked exactly like the Maria Santos whose death they had covered up in an abandoned warehouse. "Hello, Mr. Minnow." "Santos," she said with a warm smile. "Thank you for agreeing to see me. I know you're very busy, but I have some urgent business matters to discuss with you." Robert stared at her in shock and disbelief. This was impossible. Maria Santos was dead. He had been there when she died. He had helped carry her body out of that warehouse. He had attended her funeral and consoled her grieving family. "You're not Maria Santos," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Aren't I?" she replied, tilting her head with the same curious expression he remembered so well. "I have all of her memories, all of..."